Hello, I'm Alexandra Sleator, Career Accelerator, and that means that working together you'll get to achieve your career objectives faster than you would on your own. Together we can tackle a broad range of career challenges. Of course, we can support you to progress your career, and that means devising a strategy that will ensure that you get the promotion, the advancement that you target and deserve. We can support you in your career right here, right now, to help you position yourself for further advancement by helping you polish such fundamental skills as communication, influencing, motivating your team if you're a manager, or developing your leadership presence, but also personal effectiveness, time management, presenting with confidence, just to name a few. Last, but by no means least, we can help you achieve a smooth career transition, whether it means just changing your job, for example, inside your company, or moving shop, but also if you've taken a career break, to help you make a successful comeback to the workforce. And last, we can help you redefine success and identify a completely different industry for you to develop a new and rewarding career. As you can see, there are millions of things we can work on together, and the point is that working together, we will achieve your career aspirations in a time and cost-efficient way. So welcome to Career Tips. And if you're a regular viewer, you may have seen last month's offering, which was on the topic of personal effectiveness. Today, we continue in that vein, because personal effectiveness was a way to empower you to make progress against the objectives that you have set for yourself to achieve in the office and impress management in 2014. Now, we all know that playing to our strengths is fabulous, so clearly strengths have something to bring to the equation of helping us move forward and make good progress against those 2014 work objectives. But what are strengths anyway? And how do we pragmatically do that thing that we call playing to one's strengths? So here today, 5 tips on strengths. Tip number 1, identifying your strengths. Of course, that's where it naturally starts. And what I've observed is when I ask people what their strengths are, they will typically rattle off very quickly 3, 4, possibly even 5 strengths. But after that, it peters out. We are only, therefore, vaguely aware of our strengths. And if that's all that we know of our strengths, how can we play better to something we don't really know very much about? We also notice that sometimes people tell us about strengths that they don't really have. So, how do we really find out what our strengths are? Let's do a little exercise. I'm going to ask you to consider a story of struggle, a moment in your life, it doesn't need to be in the office, where things were not working well and you know that you were not playing to your strengths. And then pause the video and grab your smartphone, because most smartphones will do that, and record yourself telling that story of struggle. No need to spend more than 5 minutes. So do that now. Now, after you've recorded this story of struggle, do the same with a story of success. A moment where you know that you were playing to your strengths and you performed well. And indeed, pause the video again and take 5 minutes to record that story of success. Do that now. Right, so now you have your 2 stories, and let me encourage for the 3rd time to pause this video and to take some time to listen to yourself telling those stories, one of struggle, the other of success, and see how you feel about the difference that you should be hearing between those 2 stories. And then let's regroup. Okay, so did you hear that difference? And of course here I'm not talking about the substance of the story, the facts, right? I'm talking about how you sounded, because you should have sounded quite different telling your story of struggle than you sounded when you were telling the story of success. In the first story of struggle, your tone is likely to have been pitched rather low. And also, the tone will have been a bit dejected, hesitant, tentative, possibly even depressed. and you won't have spoken for very long, and your vocabulary will be rather simple, and your sentences quite short. In contrast, it should be that when you were telling your story of success, the pitch of your voice was higher, you were speaking a bit louder, and the tone was vibrant and excited and confident and possibly even passionate, energized clearly. And your sentences were longer and the vocabulary richer, more fuller. You used possibly more metaphors in that story of success so that you could illustrate how things happen. And you could have gone on and spoken about that story for much longer. Maybe in the first story you struggled to make it to 5 minutes, whereas in the second story you could have easily exceeded them. So the difference is one of energy. And so here is the definition of a strength. A strength is something that allows you to do well, to be at your best. When we use a strength, we are in what they call the zone. And notably, time flies. And it's not hard work. We may be working hard, but it's not hard work because that energy is there, which fuels us, propels us. And when we're done using that strength, we do not feel tired. We still feel quite buzzy. So that's a strength. It's something that allows you to do well, to perform, if we want to put that in a corporate context, without being tired and in fact with that feeling of sustained energy. So the technique I've just illustrated here for you is the technique of peak moments. Find those peak moments in your life and identify what you were doing that enabled you to pick up, to perform. And that will tell you your strengths. So again, a strength allows you to perform with energy. And that's important, that energy component. So tip number 2 to build up, dialing up some of your strengths. Indeed, once you know your strengths, you can pick and choose how to use them differently than you do today. And in particular, how to use some of them more. So the peak moment technique will have yielded some results like, oh, I can see that I'm a good listener. But it could also be something a bit more vague, which is, oh, I could see that I was paying attention. That's the same as being a good listener. What I'm illustrating here for you is the importance of not getting hung up on labels. You don't have to find names for your strengths. If you do, that's practical, but it's not necessary. The important thing is for you to have a greater inventory of the things you are and how you behave as well. That tells you about that large inventory of strengths that we all have. Similarly, you could have connected to your strengths of creativity, but you could also just have realized that you're good at proposing new ways of doing things. And that's just good enough to know as a strength. So of course, now that you know your strengths, you can look at these stories of struggle. You can know in the offices that there are situations where you're not so comfortable, and you can ask yourself, well, how about if I deploy the strengths, now that I know them, in that situation where clearly today I'm not playing to my strengths. So let's consider a very simple example of somebody who is a bit shy and struggling to speak up in meetings. But that person has connected to the strengths of listening. How can they leverage listening in order to bring themselves more into the meeting and participate more? Well, they could feedback while they heard, while they were listening, right? Not everybody listens in meetings, we all know that. So chances are that your listening capability is quite special in this context. And so if you open your mouth to share what you heard, to feedback to others, to summarize, to take stock, which is all the things that the listener can do for the rest of the meeting participants, then you will contribute and you're leveraging your strengths of listening, which means it will be easier for you, leveraging that strength, to get over your natural shyness and indeed open your mouth and contribute. So that's how, with our strengths, we can suddenly open up the range of the possible in situations which today seem a little bit locked. So knowing your strengths allows you to pick and choose which ones you want to use more, which is the dial-up process. Now, tip number 3, avoiding strengths overuse. Clearly, if you're going to dial up some of your strengths, you're going to use some of them more. And so here I want to be very careful to advise you to be wary of strengths overuse. You see, that person that we just discussed, that listening person, if all they do in all those situations where they are uncomfortable is leverage that one strength of listening, over time, I can assure you, they will find listening quite hard. This natural talent that is a strength will deplete itself, and while they may still be able to do it, which is the performance element of a strength, they will find it tiring. The energy will have gone out, and that's the signal that you're overusing a strength. So if you're overusing a strength, you know that you used to be very energized when doing it, and now it's not at all the same feeling. You're in that space, sadly, of strength overuse, and therefore you need to dial it down. You need to stop using it as much so that the talent can refresh itself and come back to you with that energy that is so characteristic of a strength. So in order, of course, to avoid strength overuse, you need to vary your strengths. Since you have, an inventory of your strengths, be strategic and be fine-tuned how you're going to use this strength in this particular moment and that other strength in this other set of circumstances. Don't always use the same strengths. The key to playing to your strengths is that plurality, that variety of using a range of strengths across the range of situations which characterize your life at work and, of course, outside. So that was tip number 3. Now tip number 4, substituting learned behaviors. What is learned behavior? Well, learned behavior can be two things. Learned behavior is actually what happens when you use a strength too much. It's the product of a strength overuse. So when you have a strength that you've depleted due to overuse, we've already discussed that you need to dial it down, moderate its use, and hopefully the energy will come back and the strengths will work again. But learned behaviors, like the terminology says, are behaviors that we've learned are useful for us. And because they are useful, because they allow us to achieve and therefore to gain the rewards, we have incorporated them in our behavior patterns. And so learned behaviors, like strengths, have that performance dimension. When we use a learned behavior, we perform, just like when we use a strength. And so the big difference is that when we use a learned behavior in contrast to a strength, it drains us. And I'm sure you can reflect easily on behaviors that you have and that are very helpful to you in the office, but when you use them, you feel very tired. So the question here is, well, now that we know more about our strengths, how about replacing some of these learned behaviors with a strength so that we would keep that performance capacity and not be so tired? Let me illustrate again with an example and going back to that challenge of speaking up in meetings. You see, this is a challenge I had. It was not natural for me to speak up in meetings, and yet I knew that speaking in meetings would be good for my visibility and, my career advancement, so I did it. And later on, when I learned about strengths, there are dictionaries of strengths out there, and I find one strength called spotlight. Spotlight is the strength of being naturally able to be the center of attention, which is what happens when you need to speak up in meeting. So someone who has the natural strength of spotlight will be very confident speaking up in meetings, standing up and doing presentations, all sorts of things. Clearly, for me, spotlight was a learned behavior. I was forcing myself to go into the spotlight, and I was good at it. People didn't think that it was such an effort. But for me, after meetings where I'd spoken up, I was really tired. So that's my learned behavior of spotlight. But when again I continued learning about strengths, I discovered I had one strength called counterpoint. That is the strength of naturally being able to see a variety of perspectives, and therefore to be able to offer that, especially in the context of a meeting where people are maybe brainstorming or looking for solutions, right? Exploring alternatives and possibilities. And that is something, that I'm naturally good at. So instead of leveraging my learned behavior of spotlight, I started using my natural strengths of counterpoint. and I would feel the difference in energy when I was exercising my counterpoint strengths and offering these alternative possibilities, challenging, the status quo. I was really in my zone, and suddenly speaking up was no longer a problem, and I didn't leave the meeting feeling drained as I usually did. So that's an example of when you start understanding which of your behaviors are learned and which of your behaviors are really the product of strengths, you can really start playing around with them. So indeed you can dial up some strengths, but in the process of dialing up some strengths, you will also be retiring possibly some of these learned behaviors which, while helpful, are so damn tiring. So that's the second level of using strengths, not just to increase, but to substitute. So now, tip number 4, making weaknesses irrelevant. Ooh, that sounds interesting, I hope. Let's take stock. So what have we said about strengths so far? Well, we have said that to play better to strengths, you need to know them. And I've shared with you the peak moment technique in order for you to identify your strengths without always the need to label them very precisely. Then we talked about dialing up strengths, which is bringing strengths that are today absent from some situations in order to expand the range of possibilities to make you more comfortable across more situations. And linked to that, we talked about retiring learned behaviors which allow you to perform that are very draining by substituting some of those learned behaviors with strengths that energize you. We've talked about the risk of strengths overuse and therefore the importance of varying the range of strengths that you use. And that if you do indeed, sadly, it happens to all of us, overuse a strength, then dial it down for a while so that the talent can refresh. Now, all of us have weaknesses, and let me be very clear, this is not going to get rid of weaknesses, but it will bypass some of them. So indeed here the reasoning is a little bit the same as with learned behaviors, right? If you are sometimes confronted to situations in the office where you have to do something that really doesn't play to your strengths, you're not necessarily even using a learned behavior, you're just plain using a weakness. And so indeed, therefore, the same reasoning, which is to substitute a strength for a weakness, can make sense. Going back to my example of my challenge with speaking up, if spotlight had not been for me a learned behavior, I might have been completely silent in meetings because spotlight would have been a downright weakness. But through counterpoint, I was able to bring a strength to the situation and to speak. So whether I used counterpoint to retire a learned behavior or to compensate and effectively avoid a weakness, the process is the same. Substituting strengths works for both learned behaviors and, of course, for weaknesses. But sometimes it's not possible to substitute a strength, right? So here, the idea is to look at others for their strengths. Now, I have a strength that's called detail, which means that I don't mind getting buried in the details and I don't mind reviewing documents very precisely, and I'm able to spot inaccuracies. But not all of us have this strength, right? And in some corporate environments, not to have the strengths of detail can actually be quite a vulnerability and a risk of underperformance. So we have some folks who do not have that natural strength of detail who are yet asked to look at things in detail. So how do they cope? Well, I encourage them not to make detail a learned behavior because that's very tiring, but instead to look at detail, that strength of detail, in others. And here your colleagues can be a boon. Find your colleagues that are strong in that strength of detail and ask them to review your work and spot your mistakes. And chances are that you will have a strength that your colleague doesn't have. So you can strengths share. That's really what collaboration is about, and that's why diverse teams are so powerful, because of that mix of strengths. So my last tip was that you can not only substitute strengths for learned behaviors and weaknesses, but you can look beyond yourself for strengths, and you can tap into other people's strengths once you're good identifying them. So, you know, there are ways to spot other strengths, but this is a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial today. But anyway, I wanted to give you a sense of the richness of working with strengths, and I hope you will be as excited as I am by it. If you'd like to talk more about using strengths, you know where to find me, and my email address is appearing on the screen right now if you'd like to contact me. More generally, I hope that this offering was useful and that you will want to have a go at the peak moment technique and find more of your strengths so that you can play to more of those that dial up. But also try and see if you can substitute some of your strengths for some of your existing learned behaviors and even possibly weaknesses. I'd love to hear about your experiences of working with strengths if you have some already, or as you leverage some of these tips, what is happening. Don't hesitate to comment using the box below the video and share with all of us your experiences of working with strengths. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has provided food for thought, and I will look forward to seeing you very soon for more career tips. In the meantime, best wishes for working with strengths, and take very good care. Bye-bye.